The Hanged Man, Sacred Pause and the Hidden Power of Suffering. The hanged man doesn't fight gravity, he surrenders to it. Suspended upside down, with one leg crossed like a dancer frozen mid-spin, he embodies the paradox of spiritual growth, insight through stillness. He doesn't act, he allows. He doesn't climb, he descends inward. This is not weakness, it's initiation. In the tarot, this figure isn't just hanging there for show. He's teaching us that transformation begins when we stop running and start listening. It's like life hits pause, not to punish, but to realign the soundtrack of our psyche with something deeper, something divine. From a mythological lens, the hanged man echoes ancient tales of sacrifice and transcendence. Think of Odin, who hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, to gain sacred knowledge. Or Christ, whose crucifixion wasn't just agony, it was revelation. The symbolic inversion here isn't just about flipping the body, it's about reversing the ego's expectations. The world doesn't have to obey your logic to make sense. Sometimes, only through this reversal do we see clearly. Upside down becomes right side up in the language of mysticism. When people hit rock bottom, be it burnout, heartbreak, or depression, it can feel like the world has turned on its head. But perhaps that's the point. The hanged man lives in all of us when we're forced to pause, when progress halts, and we're stuck in a job we hate, or we're ghosted by someone we trusted. These moments of limbo aren't meaningless. They're invitations to descend. This is where shadow work begins, where we peel back the layers of persona and touch the unconscious. Carl Jung would call it individuation in motion, or more precisely, in stillness. And let's not forget, this card also dares to romanticize suffering, but not in a toxic, glorified way. It reframes pain as portal. Those who sit long enough in discomfort may find they start to hear whispers from the soul. Journaling in silence, lying in the grass with no goal, or reading Mary Renault's mythic prose under moonlight, these simple acts become rituals of return. This isn't about becoming passive. It's about learning when passivity births new sight. Transformation doesn't shout. It waits. So, as the hanged man hangs, neither dead nor alive, neither lost nor found, we're left wondering what he's becoming. Not yet reborn, no longer who he was. It's the uncomfortable in-between that prepares us for what's next. A space not unlike the womb or the grave. And that, precisely, is where the true descent begins. Symbolism of suspension and immobility. Suspension isn't just stagnation, it's sacred preparation. The hanged man isn't stuck, he's planted. Like a seed buried underground, his immobility is a stage of becoming. Many people rush to escape moments of stillness, calling them failures or setbacks. But in the tarot, this archetype teaches that destiny sometimes requires you to pause, not to punish, but to rewire. Being bound isn't always a prison, it can be a womb. What if your burnout or heartbreak was actually nature holding you in place until your roots were deep enough to hold the divine? We live in a culture obsessed with movement, hustle, grind, achieve, but the psyche doesn't evolve through speed. It evolves through depth. That's why initiations across cultures, from ancient rites of passage to Taoist contemplation, involve isolation, stillness, and symbolic death. The suspension we see in the hanged man mirrors these sacred pauses. In real life, this could look like solitude after a breakup, a sabbatical that feels terrifyingly empty, or even a moment of illness that stops everything. Yet inside this void, something ancient is brewing. There's a reason the hanged man dangles from a tree. Trees are symbols of rootedness, of life connecting sky and soil. Jung saw trees as unconscious symbols of the self, growing upward and downward at once. This is no accident. The figure's position mirrors the cross of crucifixion and the fetal curl of a newborn. He's hung between worlds, between what he was and what he will be. The tension of immobility becomes a crucible, pressing the ego into humility, asking us to surrender our illusions of control. If you've ever felt paralyzed by indecision or trapped in a liminal season, you've touched this archetype. The invitation isn't to break free, but to go inward. Try meditation, but don't expect enlightenment, just listen. Lie on the floor and do nothing. Let silence stretch longer than comfort allows. Or read Mircea Eliade's work on initiation rites, which reveals how every culture understands that the path to awakening requires a fall. We don't grow only in the light. We grow in the dark too. Suspension is never final. It's a sacred pause before motion returns, a recalibration of soul with cosmos. The deeper the stillness, the more potent the emergence. And when it comes, that movement won't be ego-driven, it'll be soul-guided. But to receive it, you must remain long enough in the womb of immobility to hear what the universe has been whispering all along. Psychological interpretation and depth psychology. In the landscape of depth psychology, the hanged man is not just a symbol, he's an experience. Carl Jung would call it a confrontation with the unconscious, a moment when the ego cracks under the pressure of shadow material rising to the surface. It's not pretty. It feels like madness, and sometimes it is. But in the tarot, this suspended figure embodies the psychological necessity of descent. Neurosis, depression, even schizophrenia can be viewed not simply as disorders, but as cries from the psyche, begging for attention, for integration, for rebirth. You don't need to be in therapy to meet the hanged man. You just need to be alive. Ever felt your world collapse after years of living on autopilot? That's it. The ego, built like armor, eventually rusts and splits. We see this in spiritual awakenings, midlife crises, or the sudden loss of meaning in everything once loved. Jung believed that the only way out of such psychological death was through it. The hanged man doesn't climb, he lets go. And in that fall, he discovers the ground of the soul beneath the floorboards of the mind. This is where shadow work comes in. Most people avoid the parts of themselves they've been taught to shame. But those rejected aspects, the envy, rage, desire, weakness, don't vanish. They fester. The hanged man teaches us to stop repressing and start reflecting. Journaling without censorship, drawing what haunts us, or reading Jung's memories, dreams, reflections can open the floodgates of unconscious material. It's messy, but it's real. And realness is the first step toward individuation, the long path of becoming whole. What's wild is that society often pathologizes what could be transformation. John Perry saw psychotic episodes as symbolic journeys into the mythic underworld of the self. In other words, breakdowns aren't just breakdowns, they're breakthroughs. If supported correctly, they can become sacred encounters with archetypal truth. Of course, this doesn't mean romanticizing pain or rejecting medication. It means recognizing that suffering can hold symbolic gold when approached with reverence and guidance. The hanged man shows us that the road to psychic integration isn't paved with positivity and polished affirmations. It's a crooked trail through the forest of the unconscious, lit only by flickers of insight. It asks not for strength, but surrender. And once you've made peace with that descent, well, you're ready for something even more ancient. Initiation, sacrifice, and rebirth. Every myth worth its salt involves a descent. Whether it's Osiris dismembered and scattered, or Christ crucified on a cross, the pattern is the same. Sacrifice precedes rebirth. The hanged man in the tarot sits right in the heart of this tradition. His suspension isn't just a passive pause. It's a ritual of transformation. The ropes around his ankle aren't restraints. They're symbols of sacred binding. He's bound to a destiny that demands ego death before any true awakening. Real initiation always costs something. Usually, it's the self you thought you had to be. Think about ancient rites of passage, indigenous vision quests, shamanic isolation, or the symbolic deaths found in secret societies. These were never comfortable. They weren't designed to be. Initiation is meant to stretch the psyche beyond its old limits. In today's world, we experience this through heartbreaks that shatter illusions, job losses that force identity shifts, or even deep spiritual crises that shake our belief systems to the core. That moment when everything collapses, that's the doorway. That's the hanged man pulling you into the underworld for your sacred dismemberment. Jung, Eliade, and Joseph Henderson all understood that rebirth doesn't come through intellectual understanding. It comes through ordeal. The hanged man endures a psychological crucifixion, and this archetype reminds us that the spiritual path isn't all love and light. It's also about facing betrayal, confronting helplessness, and sacrificing control. But in that space, you're cracked open to receive something greater. You begin to feel the divine not as a concept, but as a raw presence. And that changes everything. But let's get practical. If you're in that space now, adrift, numb, overwhelmed, try treating your pain as an initiation. Read Mary Renault's The King Must Die to see how myth frames sacrifice. Start a ritual journal where each entry begins with what must die in me today. Engage in silence, but not as retreat, as offering. Sacrifice isn't always about losing something tangible. Sometimes it's surrendering the mask you wore too long. And that, my friend, is where real alchemy starts to bubble. Because once you've stepped into that space of sacred loss, of willing transformation, you're no longer just someone who suffered. You're someone being reforged. And soon, you'll discover what happens when society no longer recognizes who you're becoming. Traitor archetype and social alienation. Originally, the hanged man wasn't called a mystic or a martyr, he was the traitor. That title flips everything, doesn't it? Suddenly, this card isn't about quiet meditation under a tree. It's about exile, judgment, and rejection. This figure isn't celebrated, he's cast out. Just like Prometheus, who stole fire and was chained for it, or like Socrates, who questioned too much and was sentenced to death. The hanged man embodies the one who breaks the social contract in order to follow a higher truth. And society? It doesn't like that very much. To be called a traitor is to face humiliation, scapegoating, and exclusion. In modern terms, it can feel like being canceled, misunderstood, or spiritually outcast because you've chosen a different path. Maybe you left a religion, questioned a family belief, or stepped away from a toxic relationship. Suddenly, you're the villain in someone else's story. This card shows how painful that can be, but also how sacred. Alienation, in the realm of transformation, is often the first proof that you're no longer playing the same game. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as a lonely journey. And it's true, many who walk this path begin to feel like strangers in their own communities. The persona, which once fit so well, now feels like a costume. And once you've betrayed that old self, once you've turned your back on who you were expected to be, there's no going back. The hanged man's betrayal isn't malicious, it's existential. He doesn't betray others, he betrays the lie. And for that, he's hung misunderstood alone. But alienation isn't the end of the story, it's a passage. In a practical sense, this is the moment when you build new alliances, even if quietly. It's time to read authors who validate your rebellion, Renault, Krishnamurti, or Jung himself. Start writing letters to your future self, one who no longer apologizes for being different. Don't just mourn the exile, bless it, because being outside the system is exactly what allows you to see it clearly. And from that clarity, you'll start to hear a very different voice. Because once you've been cast out, you're finally free from playing a role. And what comes next, after you've accepted this sacred estrangement, might just be the most paradoxical gift of all. Mystical paradox and transcendence through consent. Here's the twist. The hanged man doesn't suffer because he must. He suffers because he chooses to. Not as a victim, but as a mystic. That's the core paradox. He consents to his suspension, and in doing so transcends it. This is where the archetype becomes deeply spiritual. The phrase, "It is not the bleeding that calls the power, it is the consent," captures this brilliantly. It's not the agony that transforms, it's the agreement with the agony. That flips the whole script on pain and opens a door most people never even realize exists. Think of people who endure hardship without bitterness. Not because they're weak, but because they've aligned themselves with something higher. Nelson Mandela, Viktor Frankl, even fictional characters like Neo from The Matrix, who chooses surrender before discovering real power. These are hanged men, souls who realize that spiritual growth isn't about conquering life, but consenting to its wild, often absurd choreography. And through that surrender, they become more than human. They become conduits for the divine. But let's not romanticize suffering too fast. This isn't about submitting to abuse or injustice. It's about inner alignment. Consent here means consciously accepting that the path includes paradox. That stillness can be movement. That sacrifice can be liberation. That crucifixion can be rebirth. Taoism has echoed this forever, action through inaction, water that breaks stone. The hanged man doesn't fight. He leans into the fall. He becomes the fall. And that's where he finds peace. Practically speaking, if you're in a tough situation right now, ask yourself this: what part of me is still resisting what already is? Try journaling with that question. Meditate not to escape, but to feel everything. Read the Tao Te Ching or explore Satori through Zen koans. Let your consent be spiritual defiance, your rebellion against resistance. Not because life is fair, but because choosing to dance with fate shifts the entire game board. It turns you from pawn into portal. And once you've tasted that kind of paradoxical freedom, where surrender feels like flight, you're no longer just enduring suffering. You're transforming through it. And at that point, something strange begins to happen. What once looked like collapse starts to resemble healing. Spiritual crisis as a healing mechanism. Modern psychiatry often labels collapse as dysfunction, but depth psychology dares to see it differently. Jung, John Perry, and other pioneers recognized spiritual crisis as a potential catalyst for healing. The hanged man reflects this beautifully. He doesn't just dangle in despair, he's entering a sacred breakdown. That state of suspension, of confusion and immobility, isn't a detour from health, it might be the medicine. When the ego crumbles, the psyche finally has space to rearrange itself more truthfully. We all know someone who's hit their limit. Maybe it was burnout, so deep they couldn't get out of bed. Or a breakup that made them question who they even were. Or worse, those quiet moments when life just loses flavor. These aren't just emotional dips. In the light of the hanged man, they're initiatory passages. Jung called it the night sea journey, a mythic descent where meaning is not found through fixing, but through facing. Pain here becomes a teacher, not a punishment. Spiritual healing rarely comes wrapped in a bow. It often begins in the ruins. That's why the hanged man must hang. He has to stop pretending. This moment of crisis strips everything away. What's left? Maybe nothing. And that's the point. Healing begins when the false self dies. Depth psychology teaches that neurosis is often the soul's way of saying, "You're off track." Rather than suppress it, we listen. We dream. We paint. We surrender. And in doing so, we invite the unconscious back to the table. Want to engage with this consciously? Start by tracking your dreams. Jung called them messages from the unconscious. Read The Far Side of Madness by Perry, which reframes breakdowns as breakthroughs. Avoid the trap of productivity. Spiritual healing is not about getting back to work. It's about creating new inner architecture. Make art without purpose. Take long walks without direction. Let life feel strange for a while. That's how the soul finds new form, through surrender, not structure. And as you allow that slow, strange healing to take root, you begin to notice something wild. Your rhythms shift. You breathe with the world differently. And that change, it's not random. It's a reconnection with something far older than society, something cosmic. Reconnection to nature and the cosmos. There's a reason the hanged man dangles from a living tree. Not a dead post, not a gallows, but a tree. That image matters. It roots the archetype in nature, in the living pulse of earth and cosmos. In many traditions, trees are sacred mediators between worlds, roots deep in shadow, branches brushing the divine. The hanged man isn't just suspended, he's planted. He becomes part of something greater. He reminds us that spiritual evolution isn't about escaping the world, but realigning with it. When we hit those moments of psychological suspension, it's tempting to look upward, away from the mess. But the hanged man teaches us to go downward, into the soil of the psyche. That's where true reconnection happens. He hangs not in shame, but in sacred relationship with the cosmos. His view of the stars is upside down, yes, but maybe that's how you start to see clearly. Mystics from all cultures have known this. The divine speaks loudest through nature's rhythms, not through man-made noise. In practical terms, this might mean stepping away from screens and returning to the real. Try walking barefoot on grass, not to be trendy, but to feel how the ground holds you. Sit beneath a tree for an hour without distraction. Read Mircea Eliade's writings on sacred time and space, which suggest that ritual isn't only candles and chants. It's entering communion with the deeper pulses of life. Let the sky set your schedule, not your calendar. Watch the moon. Listen to birdsong. This is what it means to breathe with the cosmos again. The hanged man's solitude isn't isolation, it's integration. He hangs alone, yes, but only so he can hear the song of the universe undistorted. Jung believed the unconscious was not separate from nature, but an expression of it. So when we ignore the earth, we ignore ourselves. Healing begins when we see our nervous systems not as machines, but as ecosystems. That shift in perspective isn't just poetic, it's transformational. And from that place of natural attunement, where roots meet stars and stillness meets breath, something begins to stir. A realization that this journey through the tarot isn't linear, and that each archetype is part of a greater rhythm, one that's about to shift again, revealing new layers of the self through unexpected contrasts. Contrast with other tarot archetypes. The journey of the hanged man makes more sense when you zoom out and look at the arc of the major arcana. He doesn't arrive from nowhere. He comes after the passionate union of the lovers and the courageous mastery of strength. That alone says a lot. At first, the tarot teaches us to love, to connect, to choose. Then it urges us to harness inner power and tame the beast within. But the hanged man flips all that. Suddenly, love isn't enough. Strength isn't working. You're left dangling between worlds, unsure of what comes next. This card represents a turning point, a descent after the heroic climb. The lovers suggest romantic or soulful fusion, and strength teaches controlled assertiveness. But the hanged man, he teaches surrender. That's jarring. It's like training to be a warrior, only to be told that your next move is to let go. No sword, no roar. Just stillness. For many, this feels like failure. But in truth, it's evolution. What worked before won't take you further. You have to switch gears from doing to being. That's what makes the hanged man such a vital teacher in the spiritual journey. He comes when everything else stops working, when passion becomes confusion, when discipline becomes exhaustion. The contrast reveals that true transformation isn't about powering through, it's about stepping aside. This is when people turn inward, often reluctantly. Meditation replaces manifestation. Reflection replaces action. The inner world takes center stage, and suddenly, silence becomes more potent than words. Practically speaking, this is the moment when you put down the self-help books and stop chasing strategies. It's time to ask deeper questions. Who am I if I stop trying to fix myself? What if the goal isn't to win, but to wake up? If this resonates, try reading Jung's The Red Book instead of another productivity guide. Sit with tarot cards not for prediction, but for presence. Don't rush to interpret, just observe. Let the hanged man slow you down enough to see what's always been beneath the surface. And when you've accepted this new tempo, when the old archetypes no longer define you, you'll start to sense something stirring. A metamorphosis not of effort, but of essence. And right behind that stillness, the next phase begins to bloom. Metaphysical transformation and future emergence. The hanged man isn't the end of the line, he's the cocoon. While the world thinks he's stuck, something sacred is happening beneath the surface. His suspension isn't just passive waiting, it's metaphysical composting. In this stillness, the ego decomposes. The old identity, ambitions, and personas begin to rot, making space for something entirely new. And that new thing? It's not another mask. It's essence. It's the birth of the true self. Like a seed breaking in darkness before blooming in spring, the hanged man is the hidden phase of radical emergence. This is where the tarot gets truly alchemical. The hanged man foreshadows the world, the final card, the cosmic dancer, the one who moves with the rhythm of the divine. But before the dance, there must be the hang. There must be the undoing. And so we learn that transformation isn't about improving, it's about dying and becoming. You don't evolve by upgrading your ego. You evolve by composting it. Only then can the psyche flower into something expansive, fluid, divine. You can feel this shift in real life when your goals dissolve, but your clarity increases. When you no longer crave success, but seek meaning. When you stop chasing purpose and begin embodying presence. This is metaphysical transformation. You're not just changing jobs or relationships, you're changing the frequency you exist on. This is when people start dreaming vividly, channeling insights, or experiencing synchronicities so precise they make logic blush. The soul is speaking. Are you listening? To honor this emergence, don't rush it. Protect it like you'd protect a sapling from harsh wind. Journal, but not to analyze, just to record what's moving through you. Read Joseph Henderson's work on symbolic rebirth and notice how myth is playing out in your daily life. Take long walks with no direction. Spend time in liminal spaces, doorways, forests, dusk. These in-betweens echo your own becoming. The world you once lived in doesn't quite fit anymore. Good. You're not meant to go back, because soon the ropes will loosen. Gravity will shift, and from the suspension of the hanged man, a new being will rise, one who no longer walks, but dances in rhythm with the cosmos. But before that final liberation, there's still one more initiation. Existential suffering and divine redemption. In the darkest hour of the soul, when even hope feels like a cruel joke, the hanged man holds steady. He invites us to look again, not outward, but inward. His posture mirrors the crucifixion of Christ, an archetype of existential abandonment that turns into divine reunion. This isn't just religious iconography, it's a map. First comes betrayal, then despair, then, if you stay long enough in the fire without running, a strange peace arises. The ego burns, but something luminous remains. Something eternal. That's redemption, not escape, but transmutation. Spiritual suffering has a rhythm. It begins with collapse, spirals into confusion, and culminates in surrender. But the magic happens when you stop begging for the pain to end, and instead listen to what it's trying to birth. The Hanged Man teaches us that suffering isn't random. It's sacred pressure, a necessary contraction before expansion. Carl Jung wrote that no tree can reach to heaven unless its roots reach to hell. That's the whole story here. The descent into sorrow is also the descent into soul. This paradox is why mystics always seem a little off. They laugh at funerals, find beauty in grief, and talk about joy while their worlds burn. Not because they're delusional, but because they've met something real on the other side of despair. Like Osiris resurrected by Isis, like the phoenix in flames, like the caterpillar dissolving into mush before becoming the butterfly, the Hanged Man becomes the bridge between loss and love. His suffering gives him sight, and through that sight, he sees the divine not after pain, but in it. Want to walk this path with awareness? Don't just numb your pain, dialogue with it. Ask it what it's trying to teach. Read mystical texts like The Cloud of Unknowing or John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. Create rituals to honor what's been lost. Light a candle for each betrayal that shaped you. Sing for your solitude. Cry not to end the sadness, but to baptize it. These aren't acts of despair, they're acts of reverence. They say, I see the divine even here. And when you can look at your deepest suffering and whisper, thank you, without flinching, then, and only then, you'll feel the shift. The cross becomes the key. The pain becomes the portal. And what once felt like the end reveals itself as the beginning of everything.